So, good evening to all of you on behalf of Center for India West Asia Dialogue. Today is our second last lecture of the 7-day lecture series, and it is with great, I'm very empowered, and so are you, that we have the presence of Professor A.K. Ramakrishnan with us today, and I have been his student, and uh, when I actually transitioned from media studies to international relations, I still remember how he uh, taught us how to look into the theoretical paradigms of things, and he taught us all about the West Asian thinkers, which was something which was very nascent for me, and something which also imbibed a lot of curiosity, which prevailed on me for a very long time, still prevails on me. And one thing which I really learned from Professor Ramakrishnan was how to put forward the nuanced argument with patience, without a word more, without a word less, so that it makes sense on the grounds of justice and on the grounds of human rights for even those who do not or are not connected with the paradigm. So I'm very thankful to you, sir. And here's a bio which I have prepared, but it doesn't really do justice. So our guest, Professor A.K. Ramakrishnan, is professor and former chairperson of the Center for West Asian Studies, School of International Studies at JNU. He has also been director of the Human Rights Studies program at JNU. Earlier, he was professor and director of the Center for West Asian Studies at Jamia, Millia, Islamia, and director of the School of International Relations and Politics at Mahatma Gandhi University, Kottayam, Kerala. He is a distinguished international scholar at Bucknell University, Pennsylvania, and a visiting professor in Allameh, Tabatabai University, Tehran. I'm sure I did not pronounce it right. He was also Erasmus visiting professor at University Pompeu Fabra, Barcelona, Spain, Kaunas Technical University, Lithuania. Areas of his interest include West Asian studies, theories of international relations, gender, and postcolonialism. He has published widely in English and Malayalam, and he has published the book US Perceptions of Iran, Approaches and Policies and Co-edited Society and Change in Contemporary Gulf. His articles and reviews have been published in journals such as International Studies, Scandinavian Journal of Development, Alternatives and Area Studies, Millennium Journal of International Studies, Contemporary South Asia, and Inter-Asia Cultural Studies. So I'm really very thankful to Sir that he, agreed to speak about settler colonialism and the question of Palestine for us today. I would request all of you to take notes because it's going to be really, really something that you would always want to go back to. And with this, I would like to give the presentation over to Professor Ramakrishnan.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shubda Chaudhary, for those nice words. And it's always great pleasure to have a dialogue with yourself and students and whoever has joined who has an interest in Palestine. First of all, I will just talk about my approach to the whole Palestine-Israel conflict. I view the Palestine question from a decolonial perspective, which simply means that one should understand the basic colonial character of the Palestine question and think about ways of decolonizing Palestine so that there would be an independent and a free Palestine, which is the colonial occupation of Palestinian lands is the basic issue within the conflict. And in that kind of a sense, The Israel-Palestine conflict is not a very complex conflict, as many of us would like to talk about it. It is simple at one level in the sense that if you end colonialism today, occupation today, the major aspect of that conflict is resolved. And therefore, one has to focus on that fundamental aspect of the conflict and move forward. A decolonial approach, especially on Palestine, requires looking at the contributions of Edward Said, the major Palestinian thinker, whose major works, Orientalism covering Islam and the question of Palestine. The trilogy with regard to Orientalism about the colonial discourse of how the West viewed West Asia and other parts of the world, how Zionism has been a colonial project in Palestine, in the question of Palestine, he described that, and the views about Islam in the West and the problems attached with that in covering Islam. In all these three books, he has mentioned about the formation and the working of the colonial discourse. And we know that postcolonialism as a field of inquiry itself was developing out of that analysis of a colonial discourse. So Palestine has been at the center of developing postcolonialism as a theoretical endeavor in itself, in social sciences, in literature, in all kinds of humanities and social sciences. And Edward Said's influence was, very large when you look at it, in the very formation of postcolonialism as a knowledge endeavor. The nature of colonial discourse with respect to Palestine was analyzed by analyzing how colonial the very Zionist idea of colonizing Palestine was. And, that famous article he wrote first, and which formed part of the question of Palestine, the book that he wrote, which is Zionism from the point of view of its victims. So studying colonialism from the point of its impact rather than the point of its emanation in Europe. And that in itself, a Palestine-centric perspective on the history of their colonial existence for the last 1 century and more, that's an important aspect of any decolonial project with regard to Palestine that we think about today. It's much more difficult now because of the war in Gaza and the mammoth proportion of the loss of human life, etc., and the emotional effect of this on all of us. At the same time, as people who engage in the field of knowledge, we also have to have the courage to transform that emotional attachment to the question of Palestine to more rational understanding of the ways in which colonialism in its contemporary form is experienced by the Palestinian people, whether they are in the West Bank or in the Gaza Strip or East Jerusalem or elsewhere as refugees in large numbers. So about the colonial experience of Palestinians from the late 19th century more so after the First World War, Palestine has been under the influence of two kinds of European colonialisms. One obviously was the European idea of political Zionism, and the other was British colonialism in Palestine, especially through the mandatory provisions coming up after the First World War. So two European colonial projects were working in Palestine, and the indigenous people of Palestine of different religions, they were Muslims, Jews, and Christians living there. They had to face these two European colonialisms, particularly in the first half of the 20th century. And the character of those colonialisms, one was developing as a secular colonial project, the Zionist project, and the other was an imperialist and colonial project, part of British imperialism. And both British colonial and imperialist policies and the Zionist secular colonial project both worked together to a large extent to create the deadly impact it created, leading up to the scattering of the Palestinian people, the loss of land, the loss of human lives, the confiscation of Palestinian properties, making the Palestinian people as refugees, both in their own land, like West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza Strip, but also in the neighboring countries and elsewhere in the world. And therefore, there is a kind of total scattering of Palestinian lives that happened through this process. The establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 was a seminal event that that is in this chain of activities that were going on as part of this broader settler colonial project that I was talking about. When the World Zionist Organization was founded in the late 19th century, you might have had several discussions on that history, but I will concentrate only on the colonial aspect of it. The first World Zionist Congress was held in 1897 in Basel, in Switzerland, as you know. But before that itself, in 1891, you had the organization, the name of which was the Jewish, the Jewish Colonization Association. That was the name in 1891. And in 1897, through the World Zionist Organization, if you look at the minutes of some of these meetings, you will find one major emphasis was on the colonization of Palestine. And the colonization of Palestine is in the minutes of the World Zionist Organization meetings. And then you see in 1924, the Jewish colonization, Palestine Jewish Colonization Association, which is a new one in 1924 that was established. The first one of 1891 was mainly to send European Jews, especially from Russia and Eastern Europe, etc., to Argentina. So Argentina was one major place that was thought about as a place to colonize within the global south of that time. Even in Theodore Herzl's book, which was published in 1896, he talks about the extreme, the dire situation of the Jews in Europe and the kind of anti-Semitism that was growing in Europe. And the first part of that book is a realistic assessment of the problems that the Jewish community was facing in Europe. No doubt about it. We have differences only with the solution to that problem. And the solution he was writing about in the book, if you read the Judenstaat, the Jewish state, he talks about, there is a subtitle in the book where he talks about Argentine or Palestine. Should we go to Argentina or to Palestine? So, you know, none of these people who founded who called for the Zionist Congress were extremely religious Jews or anything. Actually, religious Jews opposed Zionist project, and therefore, first, what the World Zionist Congress was supposed to be held in one of the German cities, where they could not hold it because of the opposition from the Jewish community, and that's why they went to Basel to organize that 1897 Congress. So they were not very keen on Palestine alone. So Argentina was thought about. Already there was a movement of Jews to Argentina in the 1890s itself. And Theodore Herzl says that the colonization of Argentina is becoming a little bit difficult because there are problems between the local people of Argentina and the newly incoming Jewish people from Europe. So already there was a tussle going on. That's the only hindrance, he said, to the Jewish colonization of Argentina. And therefore, the better choice, they thought, was Palestine. There were also discussions about Uganda, as another choice. Why are they talking about the Jewish question, which was discussed a whole lot in the 18th century, in the 19th century? Marx's friend has written a book on the Jewish question. Marx himself has written about the Jewish question. Innumerable European intellectuals have written about the Jewish question. The Jewish question was a European question, a central kind of European question that intellectuals were really concerned about, because there was tremendous form of anti-Semitism in Europe. But why were the elites from the Jews in Europe interested in a colonization project? One thing that we have to remember is 19th century Europe, the kind of nationalism that we see was on the rise in Europe. And there was also the, deliberate keeping away of the Jewish bourgeoisie from European colonial projects and European growth across the world. And therefore, the Jewish bourgeoisie was looking towards other places where there is no big competition from the mainstream of European bourgeoisie. So the whole thinking that was going on about Zionism as a Jewish nationalist project, creating a Jewish national home somewhere, that was coming up in this broad context of nationalism and European colonialism as such. And therefore, that colonial character attached with European national endeavors in different parts of the global South, that character was also there within the Zionist project as well. And that's very significant that we could see. And when the whole, Aliyah, the waves of immigration of Jews from Europe started from the late 19th century, more so in the early part of the 20th century, and greater numbers after the Holocaust and all what the Nazis were doing with the Jewish people, terrible phase of human history, as we know. In Palestine, already, even before the Nazis emerged in the scene, there was already the colonization of Palestine has begun from the late 19th century itself. And by the 1930s, there was a civil war situation in Palestine because the indigenous population tried to resist greater and greater immigration. And this immigration was happening under the British mandatory authority, as you know. And the 1936-39 war in Palestine, civil war, you could say, or this is referred to as the first intifada sometimes, even though we now talk about the December 1987 intifada as first intifada, but the 36 movement was very important. Isuddin Qasim and others, the religious leadership in Palestine was also in the forefront of that struggle. Palestine, from immediately after the First World War, came under the British mandate, as you all know. Britain has already committed in 1917 through the Balfour Declaration to the project of setting up a Jewish national home in Palestine. So the most significant power of the time, which has already committed to a Jewish state in Palestine, is now becoming the ruler of Palestine through the mandatory provision. And therefore, that project becomes much more easier of establishing a Jewish state in Palestine. Just look at the League of Nations mandatory provisions, to which Britain became the mandatory authority in Palestine. The mandatory provisions say, these territories were under the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans were defeated in the First World War. France and Britain were the victorious powers, and the League of Nations came into existence in that context. And the League of Nations mandatory provisions say that these people of Palestine, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, etc., these people do not have the ability to rule themselves. And therefore, it is incumbent upon the civilized nations of the world to rule them until they acquire the ability to rule themselves. This was the mandatory provision given to France and Britain. France, Syria, and Lebanon to France, and Palestine and Iraq to Britain. You see how colonial that is, that white man's burden. And they are talking about civilized nations to a people of Palestine, which is a cradle of civilization, and Iraq, one of the earliest of human civilizations. But the civilized nations are coming from the victorious powers of Europe. So how colonial that European mentality of even taking up to themselves of the fate of the Palestinian people. And this is very significant. So that starkly colonial kind of language of the mandatory provisions and a rule according to that, you could expect that the intensity of that colonialism would be very, very severe on the Palestinian people. And it had tremendous implications, almost a death blow to Palestinian aspirations in due course, as you know. The whole division of the land and the scattering of the people and so on. And creating a big mess, and which ultimately, Britain referred to the whole problem to the United Nations after the Second World War, when it was founded. And the creation of the UN Special Commission on Palestine and the partition plan and everything else, a history that you all know. coming back to the late 19th and early 20th century Zionist project in Palestine. In the intellectual circles, there were 2 points of view, especially from Jewish intellectuals. One was from people like Shlomo Avineri, the famous Marxist intellectual, who said the Jewish colonization of Palestine was actually, he won't call it colonization, he would say, the creation of Jewish settlements within Palestine, and ultimately the establishment of the State of Israel as a historically progressive movement. Because from an Asiatic mode of production, Palestine was transforming into a capitalist mode of production because of the influx of the Jewish migration from Europe. And that capitalist mode was transplanted in an underdeveloped Asiatic mode, and therefore this is historically progressive to him. And he lived in Israel, died recently, I think. He was more than 100 years old when he died. But there were other Jewish intellectuals who were, talking about something else, about this process. And prominent among them was Maxim Rodinson, the famous French Jewish intellectual. Maxim Rodinson's parents were killed in Auschwitz. Parents were killed in Auschwitz. And he, immediately after the 1967 war, we'll come to that in a moment. He wrote a long piece in that journal. The English translation of that would be Modern Times, which was published by Simone de Beauvoir and others. And the title of that article was Israel, a Colonial Settler State. And he was analyzing the whole Jewish colonization project from Europe towards Palestine as a colonial project, not as a historically progressive development. So he was talking more about what happened to the Palestinians, what the indigenous people within Palestine. And this project resulted in the usurpation of land of the Palestinians, the exploitation of cheap labor of the Palestinians. Now you hear in this new conflict situation talking about replacing Palestinian labor with Indian labor, etc. Yeah. So the dependence on Palestinian labor was very significant from the very beginning of the Zionist project in Palestine. So totally antithetical to the views propagated by Shlomo Avineri and others. Many of you study nationalism, etc. The Marxist perspective from Shlomo Avineri. Be careful on how he is, talking about it. And Maxim Rodinson is also a famous Marxist Jewish intellectual, as you know. For him, this is a kind of pauperization of the Palestinians through a colonial project. And therefore, it is a historically regressive project. No, colonialism is a progressive project as far as the colonized people are concerned. And therefore, he was one of the first who were talking about the state of Israel as a colonial settler state. And settler state systems, as you know, how it impacted the indigenous people. We know that from the history of the United States, from Canada, from Australia, from South Africa, and so on and so forth, how settler colonialism worked in these kinds of places. What happened to the indigenous communities in the United States, in Australia, and elsewhere? What Palestinians are doing is that they refuse to be like the indigenous people, the fate of the indigenous people in the United States or in Australia or elsewhere, or in Canada or wherever it was. They refuse to be eliminated totally and refuse to succumb to the total decimation of a community and their indigeneity to colonial endeavors. And that still is the core of the spirit of the Palestinian struggle, even now. And so the kind of mode of production analysis within the left itself was having a fight over whether it was a transformation of an Asiatic mode in Palestine to a capitalist mode, or it was a colonial kind of mode rather than actual creation of capitalist systems of growth within the Palestinian territory. So the colonial character becomes extremely significant in the whole project. So it was this appropriation of land and labor, and that appropriation became came into such mammoth proportions by 1948 that the Palestinians were losing all of their land in the historical part of Palestine, which became the state of Israel in 1948. And the rest of the Palestinian territory, where you see this is the only major community in the world where you see Palestinians as refugees in their own land. Not only the indigenous people of Gaza and the West Bank, those Palestinians live there. A large chunk, in Gaza Strip, 80% of the Gazan population is Palestinian refugees coming in 1948 from that part of Palestine, which became Israel in 48. And therefore, Palestinians as refugees in their own land. Not to talk about West Bank, actually, millions of refugees coming into the West Bank. And so you have refugee camps in the Gaza Strip, refugee camps in the West Bank, refugee camps in parts of East Jerusalem, and so on and so forth. Apart from refugee camps in Jordan, in Lebanon, and elsewhere. So you have indigenous population of West Bank and Gaza, plus the newly emerged Palestinian refugees from 1948. And they are there for generations together now in refugee camps. And some of the attacks now in Gaza, Israeli attacks, were on those refugee camps. So how many times that these Palestinians were not only being thrown out, being refugees, and then being attacked at several intervals of time, as we know from. This is not for the first time that the Gazan people were attacked by Israeli military, nor is it for the first time in the West Bank or elsewhere. And so the implications of the colonial project, the settler colonial project in Palestine, is what you are seeing in your eyes at this point of time. This was not only like the kind of colonialism that we had, under the British rule in India or other colonialisms that you have seen. This has been ongoing for. There was 1967 war created a condition where all of historical Palestine came under Israeli rule. And it still is under Israeli occupation. So it's a one state now, basically for all practical purposes. What the Palestinians are demanding is that they should have sovereignty over their territory. They should have an independent Palestinian state. And therefore, at the core of the Palestinian issue is the political question of establishing a sovereign, independent Palestinian state. The Palestinian movement is divided, as you know, along ideological lines, along strategic and tactical lines, as you know. But whatever ideology you follow as a Palestine organization, the aim is the same of an independent Palestinian state. And much of our discussion on Palestine, therefore, is concentrated on the core of the Palestine issue. And that requires an understanding of creating a Palestine in future, which can come out of this ongoing colonial situation in the West Bank and Gaza. What is that situation? We know it's not only the military attacks at every point of time, but also the unlivable conditions that are created in the occupied territory. In the West Bank, Shubda knows it well. What was happening? The control over water by the occupying authorities, the checkpoints, blatant apartheid system existing. One road for the Jewish settlers and another road for the Palestinians, with innumerable checkpoints. The kind of atrocities that is, undertaken against Palestinian refugee camps in major Palestinian cities in the occupied territories at every point of time. The capture of women and children and Palestinian activists. Now through the current pause, there was an exchange of Palestinian children captured by Israel, isn't it? Which is against all international law. But this has been happening in the occupied territories for such a long period of time. So what many thinkers used to say, the kind of bare life that we have talked about a whole lot, where every cloak of human rights being taken away from the people so that they become such bare bodies, where any kind of infliction of wounds or killing of those people, etc., become very easy because they are not people with any recognizable rights under any international law or conventions or anything of that sort. Everything is taken away from them through this kind of a colonial settler project over the Palestinian people. And therefore, colonialism for Palestinians is an everyday reality. And this is one of the, one of the last colonial posts, as you know, which is said to be decolonized in the world as a political. That is why, even now, in spite of all the transformations from the global south, from Latin American countries, from African countries, from South Africa in particular, um, from different Asian countries, etc., there is still great support for the Palestinians because of the common colonial experience that we have gone through. And that is why in India also you had traditional support to the Palestinian cause. And what's happening to that, I need not talk about too much at this point of time. We are a kind of odd entity among the global south in the kind of hesitation that we have now. But look at the global south. Why are they in support of the Palestinians? Because they recognize the colonial character of the history of Palestine and also the contemporary character of it in Palestine. And therefore, for us, this is a country coming out or which came out of that colonial experience has to recognize this reality and respond accordingly. I'll stop here and would be, looking forward to the comments and questions that you want to raise. To you, Dr. Shubha.
Thank you so much, sir, for it felt as if I was back to my JNU days, and thank you so much for that. I basically, there were two questions that came in my mind, and I would open now the chat for the attendees to ask questions. In 2019, there was a book launched by a British historian who spent